The old stray dog didn't bark, growl, or run when Claire Donovan opened the shelter gate that rainy Thursday afternoon. He just stared directly at her, then slowly pressed his muddy body against the chain-link fence like he had been waiting for her specifically. Claire froze with one hand still wrapped around her car keys. The shelter smelled like bleach and wet fur, and somewhere in the back, another dog kept whining nonstop, but this one stayed completely silent. That was the first thing that felt wrong. According to the volunteer walking beside her, the shepherd mix had arrived nearly 7 months earlier after being found wandering near Route 18 outside a small Pennsylvania town. No microchip, no owner, no history. Every family who tried to adopt him brought him back within days. He's not aggressive, the volunteer explained quietly. He just acts strange at night. Claire looked down again. The dog's amber eyes never left her face. His fur was soaked near the neck where an old leather collar clung tightly against his skin. The collar looked handmade, faded almost gray with age, and stitched unevenly along one side like someone had repaired it in a hurry. The volunteer leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Whatever you do, don't try taking that collar off right away." Claire frowned. "Why?" "Because the last guy who tried ended up sleeping in his truck." Claire gave a nervous laugh, expecting a joke, but the woman didn't smile back. Outside, thunder rolled low across the cloudy sky as the dog suddenly lifted one paw and touched the bottom of the gate. Not scratching, not begging, almost like he was signaling her to come closer. Claire crouched carefully. The dog stepped forward immediately, pressing his nose against her sleeve before turning his head sideways toward the collar again. That was the second thing that felt wrong. Most shelter dogs avoided eye contact when they were scared. This one seemed desperate to show her something. "What's his name?" Claire asked softly. "We call him Rusty," the volunteer answered. "But honestly, I don't think that was ever his real name." Claire reached toward the collar slowly. The second her fingers brushed the worn leather, Rusty let out a sharp cry that echoed through the entire shelter. Several dogs in nearby kennels started barking instantly. Claire jerked her hand back in shock. Rusty didn't growl or snap. Instead, he backed into the corner of the cage, trembling violently while staring at the front entrance of the building. Then came the third thing that felt wrong. The shelter's automatic front doors slid open for a man entering from the parking lot, and the moment Rusty saw him, the dog began pulling frantically at the collar with his own teeth, like he was terrified the stranger might see it. "Hey," the man called casually from the lobby. "You folks still got that stray shepherd?" Rusty suddenly slammed his body against the kennel gate so hard the metal rattled across the concrete floor, and for the first time since Claire arrived, fear crawled up the back of her neck because the dog wasn't trying to escape the shelter. He was trying to stop someone from coming closer. The man in the lobby stopped walking the moment Rusty threw himself against the kennel gate. For a few tense seconds, nobody moved. Rain hammered against the shelter windows while the fluorescent lights above buzzed softly. Then the stranger gave an awkward smile and lifted both hands. "Easy there," he muttered. "I was only asking." The volunteer quickly stepped between the kennels and the front hallway. "Sir, visiting hours are over," she said firmly. The man glanced once more toward Rusty before backing away toward the exit. The automatic doors slid shut behind him, and almost instantly the dog stopped panicking. He collapsed heavily onto the concrete floor, sides heaving as if he had been running for miles. Claire stayed crouched outside the kennel, staring at him in confusion. She had fostered dogs before. Nervous dogs, injured dogs, dogs abandoned after hurricanes and apartment evictions. But she had never seen one react like that to a complete stranger. Rusty slowly crawled closer again until his nose touched the toe of her sneaker. His ears stayed low. Not aggressive, not defensive, just exhausted. "What happened to him?" Claire whispered. The volunteer sighed quietly. "That is the problem. Nobody knows." She explained that Rusty barely ate during his first month at the shelter. Every night around 2 in the morning, he would sit facing the front entrance for hours without making a sound. Some employees thought he was waiting for someone. Others thought he had been abandoned there intentionally and could not understand why nobody came back. But the strangest part was his collar. "He guards it like his life depends on it," the volunteer said. "One of our staff tried replacing it with a clean one after a bath." Claire looked down at the faded leather wrapped tightly around Rusty's neck. "What happened?" "He spent 3 straight days hiding under a metal bench. Would not eat. Would not sleep. He just stared at the door." Claire felt something twist painfully in her chest. Rusty lifted his head slightly when she reached toward him again, but this time she did not touch the collar. Instead, she let him sniff her hand. His breathing slowed little by little until his tail gave one weak thump against the floor. The volunteer smiled sadly. That is more trust than he has shown most people. 40 minutes later, Claire signed the adoption papers while Rusty lay quietly beside her chair. He never wandered around the office like other dogs usually did, never sniffed the trash cans or explored the room. He stayed pressed against her leg the entire time, as though terrified she might disappear if he looked away for even a second. During the drive home, Rusty refused to lie down in the back seat. He sat upright the whole time despite the rain and the winding roads, watching every passing car through the window. Once, at a red light, Claire glanced in the mirror and realized his eyes were fixed on a dark blue pickup truck stopped 2 lanes over. The dog's body became completely rigid until the truck finally turned away. Back at her small house outside Millfield, Claire opened the front door carefully, expecting Rusty to hesitate. Instead, he walked straight inside without a sound and began moving slowly from room to room. Not curious, not excited. It almost looked like he was checking the house for someone. When he reached the hallway near the guest bedroom, he suddenly stopped walking. Claire watched as Rusty lowered himself onto the hardwood floor and rested his head near the front door instead of the dog bed she had prepared beside the fireplace. An hour later, long after midnight, Claire woke up to a soft metallic noise coming from downstairs. She stepped into the dark hallway and froze because Rusty was sitting alone beneath the kitchen light, staring directly at the old leather collar in the reflection of the glass back door, as if he was afraid of what might happen if he ever lost sight of it. Claire barely slept after finding Rusty awake in the kitchen that night. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving thin fog drifting across the backyard and water dripping steadily from the gutters outside. She expected the dog to settle down once daylight came, but something about him felt even stranger in the quiet morning light. Rusty refused to eat unless Claire stood beside him. The second she stepped away from the food bowl, he backed away too, ears low, watching the hallway instead of the food. It was not fear exactly. It looked more like he was listening for something distant that nobody else could hear. Claire tried distracting him with treats, toys, even a tennis ball she found in the garage, but Rusty ignored everything except the front windows and the old collar around his neck. Around noon, Claire opened the backyard door to let him outside. Rusty stepped onto the wet grass, froze instantly, then began circling the yard in a slow pattern. Not random wandering. The same exact path over and over again. Fence. Oak tree. Back porch. Fence again. Each lap ended with him stopping near the mailbox by the driveway. Every single time, he would stare down the empty road for several seconds before continuing the circle again. Claire counted 11 laps before it finally started unsettling her. Rusty, she called softly. Come here. The dog obeyed immediately, but instead of walking toward her, he stopped halfway and lowered his head toward the collar again. Then he pawed at it repeatedly while making a low sound deep in his throat. Not a growl. More frustrated than threatening. Claire crouched carefully, trying to inspect the leather from a distance. The stitching along one edge looked rough and swollen compared to the rest, almost as if another layer had been sewn underneath. Before she could touch it, a delivery van turned onto the street outside. Rusty reacted so violently that Claire stumbled backward in shock. The dog bolted toward the front window and slammed his paws against the glass hard enough to rattle the frame. His breathing became sharp and rapid while the white delivery truck rolled slowly past the house. The moment it disappeared down the block, Rusty stopped. Completely stopped. He walked calmly back into the kitchen and lay beside Claire's feet as if nothing had happened. That afternoon, Claire called the shelter to ask more questions. The volunteer hesitated before admitting there had been other incidents. Rusty always reacted strongly to certain vehicles, especially dark pickups and white vans. Once, during a thunderstorm, he had escaped an outdoor kennel and somehow ended up sitting beside the employee parking lot staring at an empty space for nearly 3 hours. Did he ever bite anyone? Claire asked quietly. No, the volunteer answered immediately. That is the weird part. He scares people, but he never hurts anyone. Later that evening, Claire sat on the living room floor beside Rusty while scrolling through local missing pet groups online. Rusty rested quietly for almost an hour, eyes half closed. until a notification sound suddenly came from Claire's phone. The reaction was instant. Rusty jerked upright, rushed toward the device, and placed one paw directly over the screen before Claire could read the message. She stared at him in disbelief. "What are you doing?" Rusty began trembling again. Slowly, Claire slid the phone from beneath his paw and looked down at the notification. It was only a weather alert warning about heavy rain expected overnight. But when Claire lifted her eyes again, her stomach tightened because Rusty was no longer looking at the phone. He was staring directly at the hallway mirror across the room, and in the reflection behind Claire, the dog suddenly started backing away as if he could see someone standing there. Claire did not sleep at all after seeing Rusty react to the hallway mirror. She checked every room in the house twice before finally convincing herself exhaustion was making her paranoid. By sunrise, the fog outside had thickened so heavily that the street beyond her mailbox had almost disappeared. Rusty remained awake the entire night. Not pacing, not barking. He stayed planted near the front door with his body angled toward the driveway, like a guard waiting for someone who never arrived. Around 8 in the morning, Claire's older sister Melanie stopped by unexpectedly with coffee and groceries. The moment Melanie entered the house, Rusty backed away sharply into the hallway. His ears flattened, and he lowered his body close to the floor without taking his eyes off the large brown purse hanging from Melanie's shoulder. "Okay," Melanie laughed nervously. "I guess he does not like me." Claire forced a smile, but her stomach tightened when Rusty began circling slowly around Melanie instead of approaching normally. Every few seconds, his nose lifted toward the purse again. Then he started making that same frustrated sound deep in his throat while staring at it. Melanie looked uncomfortable. "Claire, this dog is weird." "He is just nervous," Claire replied, though she sounded less certain now. Rusty suddenly stepped closer and hooked one paw against the bottom strap of the purse. Not aggressively, almost urgently. Melanie yanked it back immediately. "Nope, absolutely not." Rusty froze. For several awful seconds, the room went completely silent except for the ticking kitchen clock. Then the dog walked backward into the hallway and disappeared without another sound. Melanie lowered her voice. "You need to be careful. Dogs do not act like this for no reason." Claire tried defending him, but the truth was becoming harder to ignore. Rusty seemed calm one moment and deeply unsettled the next. Worse, his reactions were becoming more specific. Not random fear. Specific people. Specific sounds. Specific objects. Later that afternoon, Claire decided to take Rusty to a local veterinarian just to make sure there was nothing medically wrong. The clinic sat beside an old gas station on the edge of town, and the waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet jackets. At first, Rusty behaved perfectly. He sat beside Claire's chair quietly while a golden retriever puppy bounced around nearby. But everything changed when an older man wearing a dark green raincoat entered the clinic carrying a folded newspaper under his arm. Rusty stood instantly. His entire body stiffened. Then, to Claire's horror, he walked directly across the waiting room and positioned himself between the man and the front exit. Not growling, not barking, just blocking the doorway while staring upward without blinking. Ma'am?" the receptionist said uneasily. Claire hurried over, embarrassed. Rusty moved. The dog ignored her completely. The old man gave a nervous chuckle. "Maybe he thinks I am someone else." But when the man took one step toward the door, Rusty moved too, cutting him off again. People in the waiting room began whispering. Claire felt heat rushing into her face. "Rusty," she snapped firmly for the first time since adopting him. The dog flinched immediately and backed away, but the damage was already done. During the exam, the veterinarian quietly asked Claire whether the dog had shown signs of obsessive behavior before. "He fixates," the vet explained carefully. "Certain trauma cases can develop unhealthy attachment patterns or protective instincts." Claire looked through the small exam room window at Rusty sitting alone in the hallway. For the first time since bringing him home, she noticed how tired he looked. Not dangerous, just worn down by something invisible that never seemed to leave him alone. Then the veterinarian said the one thing Claire never wanted to hear. "Honestly, until we understand what is triggering these reactions, I do not think he should stay in a home environment alone. He may need behavioral observation at the shelter again for a few weeks." And outside the exam room door, as if he somehow understood every word, Rusty slowly lowered his head and closed his eyes. Claire drove home from the veterinary clinic with both hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Rusty sat silently in the back seat, his head lowered. Between his front paws the entire drive. He did not look out the windows anymore. He did not react to passing trucks or strangers at intersections. Somehow that worried Claire even more. By the time they reached the house, cold rain had started falling again, turning the gravel driveway into dark mud. Claire opened the back door gently. "Come on, Rusty." The dog climbed out slowly and followed her inside without hesitation, but something about his movements felt defeated now, as though he already knew he might be sent away again. That night, Claire could not stop replaying the veterinarian's words in her head. Behavioral observation. Shelter again. The idea made her chest ache unexpectedly. She had only known Rusty for a few days, yet the thought of him sitting alone behind another metal gate felt unbearable. Around 10:30, while Claire washed dishes in the kitchen, Rusty suddenly stood from his spot near the hallway and walked directly to the coat closet beside the front door. At first she ignored it, assuming he was restless again. But then she heard a soft scratching sound. Not frantic, deliberate. Claire dried her hands and walked over. Rusty sat perfectly still in front of the closet door with one paw resting against the bottom edge. "What is it?" she asked quietly. The dog looked up at her once, then tapped the door again. Claire opened the closet halfway. Cleaning supplies, winter boots, old storage bins. Nothing unusual. Rusty immediately pushed past her legs and buried his nose deep into the far corner behind a stack of shoe boxes. A moment later, he backed out carrying something small in his mouth. It was Claire's mailbox key attached to a faded blue keychain. She frowned in confusion. "How did you even find that?" She had lost the key nearly 2 months earlier and assumed it had disappeared for good. Rusty dropped it carefully at her feet, then stared toward the front window. Seconds later, headlights swept briefly across the living room walls from a passing vehicle outside. Rusty instantly stepped backward into the shadows near the hallway without making a sound. Claire picked up the key slowly, unsettled by the strange timing. The next morning, she decided to check the mailbox before work. Rainwater dripped from the tree branches overhead, while Rusty walked unusually close beside her, almost brushing against her leg the entire way down the driveway. When Claire opened the small metal mailbox, she immediately noticed a thick envelope shoved inside with no stamp or return address. Her name was written across the front in uneven black marker. Claire frowned. She almost tossed it aside as junk until Rusty suddenly nudged the envelope hard with his nose. Inside was a single folded newspaper clipping. Nothing else. The article was old and yellowed at the edges, dated almost 4 years earlier. The headline read, "Local volunteer still missing after flood rescue search ends." Beneath the headline was a photograph of a smiling man standing beside a younger German Shepherd mix with the same amber eyes as Rusty. Claire's pulse slowed. She looked closer at the picture. Around the dog's neck was the exact same worn leather collar. A cold feeling crept through her stomach when she noticed something else. In the corner of the newspaper clipping, someone had circled one sentence repeatedly in dark ink until the paper nearly tore apart. Authorities believe Mercer may have left town voluntarily. Claire turned the clipping over with trembling fingers, expecting another note. Instead, she found a hand-drawn symbol sketched faintly across the back. 3 small lines beside a crooked triangle. Rusty stared at it so intensely that Claire finally whispered the thought she had been avoiding since the shelter. "You were trying to tell me something, aren't you?" The dog slowly walked toward the hallway mirror again, then stopped beside Claire's coat hanging near the door. And for the first time, she realized the same strange symbol from the newspaper clipping had been scratched lightly into the dried mud on the bottom of her front doorstep. Claire spent nearly an hour staring at the strange symbol scratched into the dried mud near her doorstep. 3 short lines beside a crooked triangle. She had seen it twice now. Once on the back of the newspaper clipping, and now outside her own front door. Rusty sat quietly beside her the entire time, watching her face instead of the symbol itself, almost like he was waiting for her to finally understand something important. By late afternoon, Claire made a decision. Instead of calling the shelter or returning Rusty for observation, she drove to the Millfield Public Library with the newspaper clipping folded carefully inside her jacket pocket. Rusty stayed unusually calm during the drive, but the moment Claire parked beside the old brick library building, he became alert again. His ears lifted. His body stiffened. Not scared this time. Focused. Inside the library archives room, an elderly librarian named Walter helped Claire search old local records about the flood rescue mentioned in the article. According to the official reports, Daniel Mercer had disappeared nearly 4 years earlier after helping evacuate residents during severe flooding outside town. Authorities eventually ended the search after no body was found. Most locals believed he had abandoned his life and left voluntarily after falling into debt. People stopped talking about him after a while. Walter admitted quietly while scrolling through archived articles on an old computer. Small towns move on fast when there are no answers. Claire showed him the newspaper clipping and the strange symbol. The librarian's expression changed immediately. "Where did you get this?" Claire hesitated. "It was left in my mailbox." Walter leaned closer toward the paper, visibly unsettled now. "That is not random." He explained that the symbol once belonged to a volunteer search team Daniel organized during storms and hiking emergencies. 3 lines for rivers, triangle for shelter. The mark was used to signal safe routes during evacuations. Claire felt chills crawl down her arms. "So somebody sent this to me on purpose?" Walter nodded slowly, but before he could answer further, Rusty suddenly stood from beneath the table and walked directly toward a tall filing cabinet in the corner of the archive room. His nails clicked sharply against the wooden floor as he stopped beside the bottom drawer and pressed his nose against it repeatedly. Walter frowned. There should not be anything in there except old town maps. Claire opened the drawer carefully. Inside were stacks of faded flood response records tied together with rubber bands. Rusty pawed at one bundle until it slid loose from the pile. A folded map fell onto the floor. Claire picked it up slowly. Near the edge of Millfield Forest, someone had circled a narrow service road in red marker. Beside it, written in shaky handwriting, were 2 words. "Check cabin." Claire's heartbeat quickened. Who wrote this? Walter took the map from her carefully, his face draining of color. This was Daniel's handwriting. Silence filled the room. Claire stared at Rusty, whose tail gave one slow movement against the floor for the first time since she met him. Suddenly, every strange behavior replayed differently inside her head. The fear around trucks, the reactions to certain people, the way he guarded the collar, the way he watched doors, mirrors, windows. Rusty had never been trying to threaten anyone. He had been searching, trying over and over again to lead somebody back to something unfinished. Walter looked toward Claire with disbelief written across his face. If this map was hidden in archive storage all these years, he stopped speaking as the realization hit both of them at the exact same moment. Somebody had intentionally buried Daniel Mercer's last known clue where nobody would ever think to look. And somehow, against impossible odds, a stray dog had spent 4 years trying to bring it back into the light. Claire sat motionless in the archive room long after Walter finished speaking. Rain tapped softly against the tall library windows while Rusty remained beside the old filing cabinet with quiet patience, as though none of this surprised him anymore. Claire looked down at the worn leather collar around his neck, and suddenly every memory from the past few days hit her differently. The way he panicked whenever someone reached for the collar. The way he guarded doors instead of sleeping. The way he reacted to certain strangers, certain vehicles, certain sounds. None of it had been random fear. Rusty had spent years carrying the only surviving trail back to someone the world had already forgotten. Claire pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Rusty slowly walked over and rested his head against her knee. That simple gesture shattered something inside her. She remembered the veterinary clinic, the whispers in the waiting room, the embarrassment she felt when people stared at him like he was unstable. Worse than that, she remembered considering sending him back to the shelter, back into another cage after everything he had already endured. Walter removed his glasses quietly and rubbed his eyes. That dog stayed loyal longer than this town did. Claire looked toward the old map again. Check cabin. Daniel's handwriting. Hidden away for years while everyone decided the story was already over. Why would somebody bury this? She asked softly. Walter hesitated before answering. Because if Daniel never abandoned the town willingly, then somebody lied. The words hung heavily in the room. Rusty lifted his head immediately at the sound of Daniel's name. His tail moved once against the floor. Small. Hopeful. Claire felt tears burn behind her eyes for the first time since adopting him. Not because she was afraid anymore, but because she suddenly understood how lonely this animal's life must have been. Every strange behavior had been a desperate attempt to make somebody listen. Every sleepless night, every reaction, every warning. Rusty had no way to explain himself except through patterns nobody understood. And instead of helping him, people kept treating him like a problem to manage. Claire slowly reached for the old collar again. This time Rusty did not flinch. He stayed perfectly still while her fingers brushed the cracked leather gently. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then Claire felt it. Something hard hidden beneath the thick stitched section near the underside of the collar. Her breath caught instantly. Walter leaned closer. There is something inside that. Rusty looked directly at Claire the entire time. She carefully turned the collar in her hands. The dog was trembling slightly, but not with fear now. Anticipation. Like he had waited years for this exact moment. Claire swallowed hard. He was never protecting the collar from us, she whispered. He was protecting whatever was hidden in it. Tears slid silently down her face before she even realized she was crying. Rusty leaned against her leg again, exhausted but calm, and Claire gently wrapped both arms around his neck for the first time since bringing him home. The old dog closed his eyes slowly. Not because he was scared, because, finally, somebody believed him. Walter stared at them quietly before speaking again. If Daniel left another clue inside that collar, the cabin on this map may still hold answers. Claire nodded immediately. There was no hesitation left now. No doubt. No fear. Only guilt for how close she came to abandoning the one creature who had been trying hardest to tell the truth. She wiped her eyes quickly and stood up with the map in one hand and Rusty's leash in the other. "We are going to that cabin tonight," she said firmly. And beside her, for the first time since she met him, Rusty's tail wagged twice. The rain had almost stopped by the time Claire and Walter followed the narrow service road into Millfield Forest. The headlights from Claire's SUV cut through heavy mist drifting between the trees while Rusty sat upright in the passenger seat, alert but calm. Every few minutes he glanced toward the dark woods ahead, then back at Claire, as if making sure she was still following. The deeper they drove into the forest, the rougher the road became until finally the vehicle could not go any farther. Walter pointed through the windshield. About 50 yards ahead, hidden behind overgrown branches and years of storm damage, stood a small cabin leaning slightly to one side. Rusty let out the softest sound Claire had ever heard from him. Not fear. Relief. The old dog climbed out before anyone else and walked slowly toward the cabin through wet leaves and shallow puddles. Claire followed close behind with a flashlight trembling in her hand. The front porch sagged from age, and moss covered most of the wooden steps, but Rusty moved through the darkness like he had memorized every inch of the place long ago. When Claire reached the doorway, she noticed something strange immediately. The cabin did not feel abandoned. Dust covered the shelves and furniture, yet near the fireplace sat a neatly folded wool blanket untouched by mold or water damage. Rusty walked directly to it and gently nudged the blanket with his nose. Claire knelt carefully and unfolded the fabric. Inside was a small metal box sealed tightly with rusted latches. Her heartbeat quickened. Walter stared silently while Claire opened it. Inside were photographs, emergency volunteer records, handwritten journals, and several unopened letters addressed to Daniel Mercer's family. Beneath everything else rested a silver rescue medal wrapped carefully in cloth beside a faded photograph of Rusty as a puppy sleeping against Daniel's boots. Claire covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes again. The journals explained everything. Daniel had not abandoned anyone. During the flood rescue years earlier, he discovered evidence that emergency funds meant for evacuation shelters had been stolen by local officials. Before he could expose it publicly, he disappeared during the storm. But he had hidden copies of records and letters inside the cabin, trusting Rusty to stay with the only clues left behind. Walter sat heavily in an old chair near the wall, stunned. "This whole town blamed him," he whispered, "and he was trying to protect them." Claire looked toward Rusty. The old dog had quietly curled beside the metal box, resting one paw across the journals as though guarding them even now. Suddenly she understood why he reacted to certain people, vehicles, sounds, and objects. He was not trapped in fear. He was trapped in unfinished responsibility. For 4 years he had carried memories nobody else understood, waiting for someone patient enough to follow him instead of judging him. Claire slowly removed the old leather collar from around Rusty's neck. This time the dog did not panic. Hidden beneath the stitched lining was a tiny brass key taped carefully inside. The key matched the final compartment in the metal box, where Claire found a waterproof flash drive containing scanned records and signed statements proving Daniel had uncovered the theft before vanishing. Walter shook his head in disbelief. This dog protected evidence longer than any human could have. Claire gently scratched behind Rusty's ears while tears slipped quietly down her face. "You do not have to keep guarding this anymore," she whispered. For the first time since she met him, Rusty slowly lowered himself onto the old cabin floor without watching the doors, windows, or shadows around him. He rested his head beside Claire's boots and closed his eyes completely while the rain outside finally faded into silence. By the following week, the story of Daniel Mercer spread through Millfield faster than anyone expected. The records from the cabin were verified, the hidden reports were turned over to state investigators, and the town quietly began correcting a mistake that had lasted almost 4 years. But the strangest part to most people was not the missing documents or the abandoned cabin deep in the forest. It was the old stray dog who had never stopped trying to lead someone back there. Claire noticed the change in Rusty long before anyone else did. The constant tension in his body slowly disappeared day by day. He no longer slept beside the front door guarding the house through the night. Instead, he started choosing small peaceful places near sunlight. Sometimes beside the living room window in the afternoon. Sometimes near the kitchen while Claire cooked dinner. The shadows under his eyes faded. The nervous pacing stopped completely. And for the first time since she met him, Rusty began sleeping deeply enough to dream. Claire could always tell because his paws twitched softly against the hardwood floor while he rested. One Saturday morning, Walter helped Claire return to the old cabin carrying fresh supplies, framed copies of Daniel's rescue photos, and a new wooden marker engraved with his full name. They cleaned the porch, repaired broken boards, and opened the curtains so sunlight could finally enter the dark rooms again. Rusty wandered quietly through the cabin while they worked, stopping occasionally beside familiar objects before moving on. At one point, Claire noticed him standing near the fireplace, staring at the folded blanket where the metal box had been hidden. She expected sadness in his expression. Instead, the old dog simply lowered himself onto the floor with a long, tired sigh and rested peacefully, almost like he finally understood the waiting was over. Before leaving, Claire hung Daniel's rescue medal near the cabin doorway where morning light could reach it through the trees. Rusty watched silently from the porch steps. Then something happened that made Claire stop breathing for a moment. The old dog slowly walked back inside the cabin alone and returned carrying the worn leather collar in his mouth. He placed it gently beneath the hanging medal and stepped away from it for the very first time. Claire felt tears fill her eyes instantly because she understood what that meant. Rusty was no longer protecting the evidence. He was letting it go. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the forest hills, Claire drove home with the windows cracked slightly open to let in the cool autumn air. Rusty rested quietly in the passenger seat instead of sitting upright on alert like before. At a red light near town, a dark pickup truck rolled slowly through the intersection beside them. Weeks earlier, Rusty would have panicked instantly. This time, he barely lifted his head. Claire glanced over and saw him watching the passing truck calmly before settling back down again. The fear that had controlled him for years was finally fading. Months later, people in Millfield still talked about the strange dog who solved a mystery nobody else could. Children at the shelter started leaving handwritten notes near Rusty's old kennel thanking him for being brave. The veterinary clinic removed his behavioral warning from their records. Even Melanie, who once feared him, started bringing him homemade peanut butter treats every Sunday afternoon. But Rusty never cared about attention. Every evening, just before sunset, he would sit quietly beside Claire on the back porch while the wind moved gently through the trees around the house. No pacing, no guarding, no searching, just stillness. And sometimes Claire would look at the old dog resting peacefully beside her and realize something that stayed with her forever. Humans let go of the truth when it becomes painful, but some hearts stay loyal, long after the world stops listening.